So I did this thing this week that I'll tell you about because you'll hear about it eventually, and somebody's going to ask me about it. So I joined the Unitarian Universalist Church this week. There's one I've been going to up here, and so I've had this affiliation, sort of been an honorary UU for a long time, but I've never been in a place where I could attend one church long enough that I felt like I should join it, and so I did that. But I'm still a Buddhist. So the thing is, the idea of having a religion and identifying as a particular type of religious follower is not really universal. I mean, we think of it because in the West, that's sort of the way we do things. But in much of the world, when the Buddha would talk, people would ask, who's your teacher and what does he teach? And you weren't making an identity as a Buddhist or whatever. So this idea of being a particular religionist is a little unique. But the Buddha didn't require people to abandon another religion. You just did the Buddhist practice, and that's how it went. So there were areas where he spoke out against certain ideas and certain traditions. The caste system, for example, he wasn't a fan. And personally, I feel like there are some things that are missing from the way Buddhism is practiced in the West. An intention to engage mindfully in society and concern about social justice and things like that. And so, there are other religions that kind of fill that gap. But, when you're practicing, if you're exploring other religious traditions or other things, religious or otherwise, and using them to inform your Buddhist practice, you want to be careful what you mix in. There's all kinds of trendy stuff out there, and some of it probably not really very high quality stuff. And so it helps if we have a way to look at what's true, what's spiritually valuable, what will really get us where we want to go, as opposed to just what sounds good or seems interesting or kind of exotic or trendy or what all of our friends are doing or whatever. Kind of look and go, okay, well, what is really good here? What is really true? And this is something, an idea that came up, when the Buddha was around. So being Buddhist, we talk about things like the Four Noble Truths and that sort of thing. We're talking about spiritual truths. These are things that will lead us to spiritual advancement. In politics and science and history and law and all of that, the idea of truth means different things in different contexts. But just because the word truth may be a little fluid, that doesn't mean that there aren't realities, that there aren't things that are, that we can rely on. And this is true when we're talking about spiritual matters. So when I was doing the Bright Dawn, one of the fellow students said to Reverend Koyo, I'm not sure I believe in karma. Is karma really true? Why should I think karma is true? And Reverend Kabosi said, well, you don't have to believe in karma. You don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to believe in the law of gravity if you don't want to, but I wouldn't ignore its effects. Whether you believe in karma or not, you're going to experience the results of your actions. Just as if you stepped off the top rung of a ladder, you're going to fall to the ground, whether you believe in gravity or not, right? It's kind of just the way things work, and you can test this. So when we talk about truth in a religious context, things can get kind of interesting. And the Buddha was very realistic about this. There were a lot of gurus running around back then, and amassing followers, and he had seen a number of them whose teachings really didn't go anyplace. He when he went into homelessness to live the holy life, he followed a couple of teachers and he realized that their teachings didn't go where he wanted to go. And so after his own awakening, he spent some time looking at what he had experienced to make sure that it was really true and that he hadn't overlooked anything, hadn't misunderstood anything. And so when we read the teachings from the Pali Canon, there are several discourses where he's asked what is true and what's not, and how do I know? How do I tell what's true and what isn't? And there's a very famous one that I've talked about here before. It's the Kalama Sutta. There's a group of people it was this tribe of people who asked him to come and talk to them. And they'd seen a number of teachers and heard a lot of contradictory teachings. One of the guys would say that there's a life after death, and one would say that after you die, there's nothing. And so one would say that what you do in this life affects your next, and the next one would say, well, no, do whatever you want to do because there's no effect, and so on. And so they wanted to know, how can we tell when we hear a teaching? How can we tell if it's true or not? And, the obvious thing would be for the Buddha to talk about what a great enlightened person he was and say, so if you hear it from me, it's true. But that's not what he did. Instead, he started by saying, so here's what you don't go by. Don't go by tradition. Don't go by, well, here's what the scripture says. Don't go by rumor, surmise, or axiom. Don't rely on what sounds true or accept an idea because you're comfortable with it. Don't go by someone's credentials. Don't go by the consideration, this teacher is my teacher. So it's kind of interesting here because none of those things are necessarily wrong. And in fact, some of those things are sort of tests of whether or not I want to listen to what this particular person has to say. Traditions are good to have. Teachings can be accepted over time because they're proven to work. Scriptures and axioms and things like that can be good sources of wisdom. If we've kept them around for several hundred years or a couple thousand years or whatever, they probably have something worth hearing. And advice from someone who has gone before you is good advice. But something's not true just because it sounds true or because it makes you feel better to hear it. It's not true just because some credentialed preacher says it, or because I said it, or because any other authority said it. We need to be able to put our spiritual teachings to the test. In other words, is what I'm hearing, is it really going to take me where I want to go? Is it going to lead me toward less suffering, more happiness? So where do we look then to find if something is true? And the Buddha, in this Sutra to the Kalamas, gave some advice on that. He said, if you determine for yourself that a teaching leads to harm, don't do it. That's simple enough. It's not too complicated. And then he said, if a spiritual path leads to kindness, to compassion, to gratitude, to peace of mind, then you're on the true path. So the Buddha eventually came up with an 8-step process for determining how to recognize the truth of a spiritual teaching. His stepmother became the first person or the first woman to ordain. And she had been spending some time at the monastery where he was and decided that she wanted to go out and practice on her own, which most monks and nuns did. And so she went to the Buddha to say that she was ready to leave and she was going to do this. And she asked, how do I recognize if a realization I've had, if something that has occurred to me or something that I've heard, how do I recognize if it's the truth or not? And he said this. He said, if you know that these qualities, whatever qualities arise from the teaching, lead to dispassion, not to passion, to being unfettered, not to being fettered, to shedding, not to accumulating, to modesty, not to self-aggrandizement, to contentment, not to discontent, to seclusion, not to entanglement, to persistence, not to laziness, to being unburdensome, not to being burdensome, then you can say, this is the Dharma, this is my instruction. So, that's a lot of things, and you heard me say that probably didn't mean very much to you, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit. And essentially, the Buddha is saying, okay, there are ways that we can test an idea or a teaching or a state of mind that has arisen and see whether or not it's authentic. And the first one, does it lead to passion or dispassion? So, people get kind of hung up on this idea of passion, and I shouldn't be passionate about anything if I'm practicing Buddhism and that kind of stuff. That's not really what he's saying. Does a teaching or a practice or a religion that you're following or whatever, does it increase greed? Does it increase anger or delusion? Does it encourage you to cling to things, to actions or ideas that might actually turn out to be harmful to yourself or others? And if it does, then it's not the truth. So, a lot of times we see this with spiritual teachers and with some of the sort of fad spiritual practices and that kind of thing, where we're encouraged. I mean, there's the whole prosperity gospel idea, and that sort of thing. But there's also some kind of new agey things that, you do these things and you get the stuff that you want. It's basically encouraging greed. When we encounter a religious tradition that wants to divide people, and some people look down on or are hateful toward others, that sort of thing. That's not truth. And he says, being unfettered, the spiritual practice should leave you unfettered. And so a fetter is, something that ties something to something else. So you're hanging on to something that's not a true source of happiness. There's an old saying: if you do what you always did, you'll probably get what you always got, right? If your path is having you look at life differently than you had been and leading you away from the habits that perpetuate the cycle of stress, then that's a good path to be on. That's the true dharma. If it's keeping you hanging, if you're just hanging on to stuff because it feels comfortable to you, and this is true even of religious practices, then you can't really rely on that. So he said, does it lead to shedding or to being attached? So if your spiritual practice encourages what Trungpa, the Tibetan teacher, referred to spiritual materialism, sort of accumulating spiritual practices or accumulating certain spiritual attainments and that sort of thing, and the way some might accumulate material goods, that's not good. But the other thing that happens sometimes is, a lot of the time we sort of accumulate the trappings of spirituality. And I think that's another form of spiritual materialism. So, don't get hung up on what you can say you've done at the expense of actually making spiritual growth. And then he talked about modesty. So there are people who will talk about the retreats they've been on. They've been on big retreats with famous teachers and that kind of thing, or they're looking around for whatever the next big thing is and that kind of stuff. And really sort of using your spiritual practice as an adornment for your ego. So we want to avoid that. Contentment, your spiritual journey should remind you of the beauty of the world in which you live and the abundance that you enjoy, even when things aren't going the way you like necessarily. And so if your spiritual practice is making you contented, if a teaching leads to contentment, then you're on the right path. So he's talking about seclusion. Is the teaching leading you to seclusion or basically the opposite of seclusion? Are you looking for exciting crowds of people or whatever? If your spiritual life is lived in the company of a supportive community, where there are others who practice the same, who support you on your path, who accept you as a fellow traveler and non-judgmentally offer guidance on the path, while at the same time acknowledging your need to develop your own wisdom, then that's a good path to be on. Does your spirituality encourage you to practice diligently and challenge you to go deeper and live more authentically and fully? If so, that's a good path that you're on. Sometimes, a spiritual practice requires you to make demands on others, or at least encourages you to make demands on others that believe the way you do or practice the way you do, conform to your views and things like that. That's not a true path. You want to be easy to maintain. Your spirituality should not require you to require specific things of other people. So those are a few things that you could look at if you're examining, what you're doing in Buddhism or other practices, and just the way you're living your life, if you want to see whether you're living the dharma or not. So thank you very much for your time. You want to unmute yourself, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions?
Questions or comments? And by the way, you don't have to talk specifically about what I just talked about. Feel free to ask me anything. I'm here once a month, so I'm happy to talk about whatever comes up for you. I see a hand. I can't see who it's attached to.
Yeah, Sensei Morris. It's Jennifer Moore. Thank you so much for the teaching.
Sure.
It was great. I am super curious, and if you don't want to talk more about it, don't feel obligated. But I'm super curious about your journey with the Unitarian Church and what kind of social activism you're interested in.
So, when I was a kid, I was probably 13, 14 years old. I'd been baptized and all that stuff. I went to the Baptist church with my family, and this thing happened where I realized that the church that I was going to and I were on opposite sides of several issues that were important in the late 1960s, civil rights being one of them, war being one of them. I thought war was a bad idea, and equality was a good idea. The church seemed to promote it, a different point of view. And so I stopped going to church. And this kid I was hanging out with invited me to his church. And I said, no, I'm not going to church. You'd like my church, it's different. And he was a Unitarian Universalist. And so he told me about it. So I don't remember why, but I never went to his church. I think my parents may not have been supportive of that idea, but I don't remember for sure, to be honest. But it sort of planted the seed. I knew it was there, and based on what he had told me, that you didn't have to believe specific things, and and in fact, I remember him saying, you can be an atheist if you want to and go to our church. And I was like, well, if I was an atheist, why would I want to go to any church? But I understood, what he was talking about somewhat. And then in the 80s, my son was asking questions about religion and spirituality and being exposed to various ideas. And so his mom and I thought it would be a good idea to get involved with a community. And so we started going to the UU Church in downtown Orlando. And actually the minister there had been to retreats with Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And this was before anybody knew who, he had been an anti-war activist, or at least building awareness of what was going on in Vietnam, and so he was known for that. But he didn't really start writing books, at least not that were published in English, until the 80s. So not a lot of new people knew about him. But she had been to retreats with him and started a meditation group, and we were basically reading the books that he had out at the time, which there are only a couple of them, and meditating sort of in his style. And so that was the first formal Buddhist activity I did. And that was late 1980s. So it's just kind of always been there. You guys are sitting in a UU church right now, and the UU community has been supportive of Buddhism, and there's a Unitarian Universalist Buddhist Fellowship that you're a member of. You just, we don't talk about it very much, but you you can join the UUBF as individuals if you want to, and so it's there are principles of Unitarian Universalism that I think are very much in line with the idea of with the teachings of the Buddha. It allows a lot of freedom and allows people to explore their own spiritual path, but at the same time encouraging things like compassion and love and inclusivity, which is not always necessarily present in some Buddhist communities. So I like that it's incorporated into the spiritual values of the tradition. That everyone is welcome, and so I'm not specifically involved with any particular social justice movement right now, but I'm concerned about the same things you guys are. I'm sure the growth of authoritarianism in the world, the effect in climate change and its effect on the world, and generally, I think we need to sort of be radically compassionate, accepting everyone. And so it made sense to me. And plus, it's a good community, and the minister says things worth stealing. So I told her when I've had my first conversation with her, which is probably a month or so after I started attending services there, that I've come to judge the value of someone's spiritual teachings by how many things they say that I'll repeat. How many ideas I'll steal. And she spoke about something the first time I heard her about the idea of shared ministry, and I'm listening to her and I'm going, this is exactly the kinds of conversations that we were having before I left Florida. So, anyway, it's a neat place, neat community. So I'm there every Sunday. So I figure, well, I might as well, might as well join.
Can you see her? There's another question.
Oh, here we go. Hi. Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
I really enjoyed your talk on the truthfulness piece. It's something that I've been kind of struggling with some loved ones lately, and I was wondering if you have any sort of advice as far as if two people have two different truths, and if they're unwilling to communicate about it right away, maybe how to deal with that in the time, and if it's something worth pursuing to communicate or washing your hands of if you both have two different truths. I was wondering if you had any advice on that.
Yeah. So, for example, you're sort of speaking hypothetically, so I'm going to speak hypothetically too, and see if our hypotheses align, right? So, what comes to me a lot of the time is someone's practicing Buddhism, and someone else is, a family member or whatever is say an evangelical Christian. This is a common one, and they're having a hard time figuring out how to be respectful of one another's points of view, and sometimes one or the other doesn't doesn't want to be respectful of the point of view, or at least can't buy it, right? So there's a if you really want to get into it sometime, look up the Stages of Faith by James Fowler, I think is right. Just as kids move through certain stages of understanding, stages of social interaction, and all of that, Fowler was a researcher, and he was a Christian uh, scholar, but he was also a developmental psychologist, and he said, I think people's spirituality happens in developmental stages too. And so he came up with these different stages. And at one stage, you've found sort of your identity within this certain religious context. And you said, well, this is where I am, and this is the right one, and it's the best one, and it's maybe even the only one that's good, or the only one that's true. And so you hit that stage, level 3 or 4, or whatever stage it is, and you say, this is where I'm at, and everybody else is wrong. Now you can go beyond that, and sort of the next stage is doing a lot of self-questioning, and you may end up back where you were. So let's say that you're a Methodist, and so maybe you rejected the teachings of Wesley for a while, and then you find them on a different level where you sort of come back to them, but maybe with a more refined point of view. Well, some people never get past that point where they're rejecting everything but that with which they identify. And so you're probably not gonna, you're not gonna change their mind. And not that that's necessarily what you want anyway. But if you can agree to disagree, that's not a bad thing. If you can at least agree to be tolerant of one another's points of views, that's not a bad thing. But when somebody just won't, I think the best thing you can do is just model the best thing that your religion has to offer, which is compassion and understanding, and know that it's unfortunate, but they're probably not going to go beyond where they are. But maybe if you just show them what it looks like to be at a little bit higher stage of spiritual advancement, maybe they'll want to follow you at some point. But yeah, if somebody's mind is that set in stone, trying to change their mind, usually it's just going to make matters worse. Was that at all helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. It's a very challenging one. I don't know if you were around when we did the memorial for a member who had passed away, but that was an issue with his family. He was very devout Buddhist, and they were very not devout Buddhists. They were very set in their particular religious tradition, and he loved them and cared about them, and they loved him and cared about him, but they just didn't talk about that because they just couldn't find common ground, which is unfortunate because it's there. It's there, but you have to climb to the top of the mountain, or at least get near the top of the mountain to see what the mountaintop looks like, and then that's where you can kind of see you're both looking down the same valley. Good luck with it. Let me know if I can help you in any way. I was at the prison one time, and there was a guy there who was he was one of the chapel clerks. Nice guy, he was a Baptist, very much committed to that. And I admire that. I mean, the people who stand out on the corner of Woodland and New York with their signs on Friday afternoons, they're still there, by the way. I assume they are.
Yeah, they didn't go away.
I mean, you got to admit that takes some real dedication, to get out there and do that. Although I probably don't agree with anything any of those signs say, at least you got to admire their dedication, their commitment to their practice. At any rate, he was kind of one of like that, and he was going to save my soul, and so he started challenging my religious point of view, and I said, okay, well, so in your religion, you believe this. And I recited the verse that most people of his tradition recite, And I said, well, in mine, we believe it's not about belief, it's about what you do. So you think salvation comes through believing this. I think salvation comes from doing good things, avoiding doing bad things, purifying your mind. So which of those things do you disagree with? And he kind of, what are you going to disagree with? You're going to disagree with doing good. You're going to disagree with, refraining from doing bad. You're going to disagree with, purifying your mind of things that cause you to do bad things, right? To not do good things. And then I told him that I was a much better Christian as a Buddhist than I ever was when I was a Christian. And anyway, it softened his view somewhat, to realize that I wasn't there that I was there to do good. And the chaplain there was an interesting guy too. He was Baptist, and he was very much, and he would tell me, he'd say, you guys are wrong. I think you guys are wrong, but you're doing really good things. And you guys are getting a lot of good out of it. Okay, I'll accept that. I'm wrong, but I'm doing good stuff. Okay, I could take that. Well, then it's after 8, and I want to be respectful of your time, so we can close the meeting, and I'll hang out if anybody's got any other questions while you're packing things up.
Something that's been ongoing here, at least in my mind, probably only, but the concept of truth, insight, and faith. And so we, certain things I look and the foundation of Buddhism that appear to me to be true. All things with form are permanent, right? Some things I gain insight about. Being moral makes me comfortable. I feel it's right. And then some things, you go to truth, and a lot of people take the truth, faith, and a lot of people take these faiths and say it's true. So I keep thinking about, like when you're talking, and during the elephants and the blind men, it came up, about the dharma. What do we know to be true, and what do we accept as faith?
So, so faith in Buddhism is a little different than sort of what we commonly talk about as faith. But it depends a little bit too on what Buddhist tradition we're within. So first of all, this might need to be a whole other Dharma talk, but you read something about Buddhism, or you hear a talk, or you listen to a podcast or whatever, and you go, this stuff sounds like it's got something to offer that will help me with whatever spiritual pain I'm experiencing, right? Or will help me just to live a life of greater meaning or authenticity or whatever, right? And so you explore it. So the Buddha talked about, sort of a certain process of developing what he called faith, or what gets translated as faith. He said, and there's steps and stages in this. And the first is that you draw close. Okay, you hear something, here's this guy talking. Let me get intimate with that. Let me get where I can hear it or read it or whatever, right? So you're making yourself available to hear the teaching. And then make sure you understand what's being said. So it's not just kind of a superficial understanding, but get deeply into it, listen to it enough that you know what's really being said and what it means to you and to your life. A topic like the not self characteristic, people can get really caught up in arguing about that and analyzing that and all of that. And you can recite the sutra if you want to. Doesn't mean that you understand that why this teaching that form is not self, feeling is not self, mental fabrication is not self, and so on. These things are not self. Why does this matter? It's not just something to be talked about, argued about, and, examined and think about how elegant it is as an intellectual process. Somehow or another, I'm using the idea of self to create suffering for me and probably the people around me. And if I could get that form is not self, feeling is not self, if I can understand what the Buddha was talking about, there's a way that I can use that to free myself of some of the difficulties that I'm experiencing, right? So bring that. And then once you understand what that means to you, then you put it into practice. And when you put it into practice, you realize the fruit of the practice. And that's where faith really becomes a bigger deal, because now I see that, if I practice this stuff, I experience spiritual growth as a result. I experience less pain, I experience less stress, I experience greater happiness, a greater sense of, living, a truly authentic life. Okay, so it's not just, Sensei Morris said it, and he's a good guy, and he's got the certificate, so therefore I believe it. Or, Reverend so and so said it, and he's supposed to be really close to God, and so therefore I believe it. It's okay. This guy seems to know what he's talking about. He taught it well enough that I can apply it to my life. I experience the benefits from it. And so that's really where faith comes from. Now, it's true, not because it stands an intellectual test, but because it actually works. Okay. Now, sometimes things will work, and they may not seem to fit logic very well, but you put it into practice, and you realize, oh, okay, there's something here. So things like, well, sitting on a cushion, contemplating your breath. How in the world could that benefit me in any way? But if you do it, you experience the result from it. Saying the Nimbutsu is another one. And now, and here's the thing. So it looks like sort of faith practice that we've experienced before in other traditions, and many of us have felt alienated by those other traditions, and we don't want to do this because it looks like that. But when we start to realize, okay, so the faith itself is a path, and that there is the first step on the path is you start to get rid of the stuff that's keeping you hung up, that's keeping you come back to stress and so on. Right? And then you start experiencing the happiness that comes from some degree of freedom. And then there's a little higher level. Well, I won't say it's a higher level. There's a different level where we all experience things like awe. We all experience, sometimes just go outside and look up at the sky, and just give yourself to that. there's this experience of being in the world and recognizing that you're a part of something that is too big to you for you to understand, right? And so the problem with a lot of the first turning of the wheel stuff, the polycanon stuff, is it doesn't deal in that area very much. It doesn't tell you what do I do with these feelings that I have that that I'm a part of something that's really transcends anything that my human mind can deal with. That yeah, this moment is important, but this moment is important because it connects to every other moment, from beginningless time to endless future. And so, kind of the only way of getting a handle on that is through some form of faith. Now, that doesn't mean believing in what you're told necessarily. It doesn't mean, um, yeah, just saying the words that some traditions said to say, although that's maybe part of the practice. It's encountering that for yourself. In order to do that, you need to have some faith that that's possible. But the true faith comes when you encounter that for yourself. And so, and it's not the kind of thing that, Sensei Morris can tell you how to do, or that, Thich Nhat Hanh's book can tell you how to do, or whatever. It's the kind of thing you have to do and you have to experience. And, Sensei Jim was talking about Kinsho. Was that at White Sands last week or last time I was there? I think it might have been. He was talking about Kinsho, which you can't describe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and if you use the word faith around him, it'll probably just look like you just wave something, some socks in his nose. But it is an act of there's no rational way of experiencing it, so therefore it must be faith, but it's faith in a little different way. So I mentioned James W. Fowler's stages of faith earlier. That's there. There's that level where you realize that you're on common ground with that there are people they're enlightened people everywhere you look in all different traditions, and that when you're talking to them, you might be using very different words, but you're saying the same thing. And so that's a and weirdly enough, that sort of faith, well, I believe in this because this is the book that I follow, is going to keep you from experiencing that kind of faith. So faith sucks, but it's wonderful. Did I answer your question, or did I just create a lot of extra confusion?
It's clarifying, and the choices of words between confidence and faith, which confidence and faith can keep you going.
Yeah.
There's a difference between insight, having an insight
Yeah.
into something, and faith, and then there's faith that says there's a certain realm of hell, the animal realm of hell, and I have faith in that.
Yeah. So the thing to have faith in there is that these ideas are useful.
Yeah.
Not that, okay, there's 3 levels of hell. I mean, who the hell knows? If you're not there, you don't know, right?
Yeah.
But you can recognize that when you do bad things, it has bad results. And so if you had to represent that somehow, how would you represent that? There's a discourse where this man has died and is taken down to meet the king of the underworld, and it's sort of in 2 parts. In the first part, the king of the underworld is saying, didn't you recognize that 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 you were impermanent, that that didn't you see babies and say, hey, that's me? Didn't you see someone sick and realize that that was also you, someone old and realize that's also you? And the guy keeps going, no, I didn't even think about that. He says, yeah, maybe if you thought about that, you'd have lived a better life. And then the second part, they take him and show him all the different hells that he's going to have to experience, right? And the descriptions of these things is like, Dante would cringe if he read some of this stuff. Well, the thing is, it's not that these places really exist. The thing is, if you had to look at the effects of even your thoughtless bad acts and the degree to which that might have caused suffering in the world, and then seeing, okay, if I had to experience all the suffering I caused, what would that look like? It might look like one of these hell realms, So these are really just kind of tools to use in your practice. It's not, okay. And on a superficial level, sure, there are people who think if they show up and make offerings to monks that they'll get reborn in a Dewa realm and how wonderful that will be. But the reality is, if you show up and support a spiritual community, you're going to make the world a better place. You're also going to make your heart a better place to live in.